Well, thank you, Jayati. Maybe could you tell us, because we also heard that from quite a few seminars that there are differences between different states. So Kerala has been mentioned quite a few times for the ways that communities have been organized to deal with the problems. So could you tell us something about this? Maybe some of the best or some of the worst examples at the state level or at the, I mean, at the ground level?
Okay, yes.
Jayati,
Yeah.
before you respond to Kinchi's question, there is a question in the chat which actually kind of goes to the heart of what you were saying also, which is what is the reason for this terrible callousness, indifference being so bad at the level of the central government? Why,
Yeah.
why would any government do that? So whatever order you want to take them in,
Yeah.
if you want to respond to
Sure.
Kinchi's question first, but they're kind of linked also.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, and let me take the second question first. The why, because, and then come to the, if you like, the good news in a way, the little bit, the few shreds of hope that we find within our system as well. What we've had in India over the last 7 years is a government that has essentially only one real agenda, and that is to make India into a Hindu state. Whatever that means. I don't think there's much clarity even on that, but that's the real focus. And they somehow believe, I think, I mean, I don't know what's in their heads, but they somehow believe that that will automatically deliver India into some imagined former glory, in the Vedic period when we were apparently, they were leaders 4,000 years ago or something. There is very little of recognition of expertise of any kind. Economists, well, not that economists are always right, but they don't like to listen to experts. They don't like to listen to scientists. They have a scientific advisory council which was set up to deal with COVID. They have really not listened to what they have been saying. And instead, they basically have yes men who are heading the organizations who do what the political masters tell them and say what they tell them, which means, number one, they don't get information. And number two, then they don't have the right approaches to deal with it. And then number three, they double down when there is any kind of response. So there's a set on how making full effort. Yes. So the real thing that they're good at is public relations. That's their focus. They're really good on managing perceptions and trying to tell people that, Mr. Modi is wonderful. The central government is doing much better than every other. So we are the only country that talks about absolute vaccination numbers rather than relative to population, for example. We don't talk about absolute death numbers because that would be larger. So there we will talk about, only the COVID identified mortality rates, which are very low, and so on. But ultimately, I would say, why is the government doing this? Because it is able to, because it has managed to manipulate the sentiments of a significant proportion of Indian people. I would say largely in the northern and central belt, but around half of the people, into thinking that they've got it right, they're in control, we have to trust them, we have to let them do whatever, if he says full total lockdown across the whole country, even in the Northeast, thousands of miles away from any real infection, we will believe him and do what he says. And they are able to because they have manipulated differences between people. With, as I said, religion, caste, gender, all of these have also been utilized with the purpose of staying in political control, of winning elections, and so on. The other thing that is kind of peculiar in India is that we have we had a very deeply federal system. I've already mentioned that, but it means that state governments are the ones that are seen to be responsible. So when you're in a particular state and you're not getting a vaccination, you're not getting a hospital bed, you're not getting oxygen, you're not getting wood to burn your dead, you blame your state government. You don't blame the center. But the problem is that the center actually took all the control. When it imposed the lockdown, it used something called the National Disaster Management Act, which gives it complete control over everything. But having done the lockdown, after that, it told the state governments, now you deal with it. And it didn't give them enough resources. And it has progressively taken more and more of the tax revenues. So it's really hard for state governments, even with the best will in the world, it's really hard for state governments to do what they can. And so another reason why the central government has behaved in this way is because, and this took me a long time to realize, you keep asking yourself, why are they doing this when they could easily do something that would actually benefit people and not harm them? I think it's because their, what economists call their objective function is different. The things that they want to maximize are very different from what a normal government would want to achieve. So I think there is a basic fundamental difference in goals, which is why the central government has chosen this path, and it is able to be on that path because people have accepted it for various reasons. Whether that remains is a different issue. On the state governments, so remember, they're all hamstrung. They all don't have enough money. Again, there's a lot of politics being played. The BJP-led state governments get more resources, they get more vaccine doses, they get more ventilators, they get more benefits in general. Even so, it's the BJP-led state governments that have handled it the worst. Again, because, as I said, the objective function is different. The goals are different. The largest state of Uttar Pradesh, around 200 million people, has in the second wave seen the worst conditions. The bodies floating down the Ganga River, which have been shown globally, those are really all from that state. And the total collapse of any infrastructure to deal with was all evident in that state. By contrast, we have state governments that show that if you really have the motivation, you can deal with it. And Kerala is outstanding in that respect. Because Kerala, from the very beginning, it was much more aware of the problem, but also it relied hugely on community participation to manage the pandemic. And this is a very different model from a top-down thing that says, I'm announcing a lockdown, you have to stay at home, I will beat you on the street if I see you. All of that, no. This was explaining to people why we need to do this, what you need to do, how you can do it, and trying to help. Now, this is also facilitated by the fact that Kerala, because the state government controls the health system, the left government had brought in a system of community activists at every level, down to the village level, who were able to inform and act as a kind of, conduit and liaison between the state and the people, to inform people about the kinds of things that can happen, and to inform the local governments. They have very strong local governments, panchayats they're called. They have very strong local governments active, that this household is in trouble, that household is not able to get food, that group of migrant workers doesn't know what they will do because their employer is not giving them any wages. That kind of information would then get transmitted to local governments, and there was always an attempt to actually do something. So from the very beginning, the system of providing food baskets with all the essentials, not just grain, but all the essentials that you will need, edible oils, soap, basic vegetables, etc., lots of things. The need to identify the households that are sick and the special things that they will need, not just isolating the patient, but supposing that was the breadwinner, supposing that was the person who did all the cooking, how do you manage the rest of the household? All of these things were possible because of the very strong community participation, which is why also in Kerala, the migrants didn't leave, because they were being fed, housed, clothed in in decent numbers. Yes, there were waves of infection, nonetheless. And as I said, more than any other state, it's really facing a budget crunch because it's actually spending on these things. It's actually trying to make sure that minimal health and social protection things are covered. For that reason, in fact, despite the successive waves, remember, Kerala is a high migration state, so it keeps getting people coming in, and so it has really experienced these successive waves. Despite that, mortality rates have been very low in Kerala, and overall, the state has managed this pandemic quite well.
Jayati, there are a couple of questions which expand on the first big question. They're in the chat box, but basically they have to do with the issue of enduring popularity of the state, the central government, and the question of democracy. That this notion of India, the biggest democracy in the world, and was that impacted? So if you would like to take those.
Very quickly, because I know Anu and Urvashi have much more to say on this and are more knowledgeable. You know, India was a functioning democracy. Of course, we didn't have economic democracy and economic rights were ignored and so on. But we were a functioning civil and political democracy. This has been progressively undermined by the Modi government over the past 7 years, well before the pandemic. But the pandemic has provided a huge excuse. It's not just dissent that was suppressed. Parliament was not convened. Even online parliament was hardly convened, and it's being misused in the most terrible ways. Information is being suppressed. Data that were collected for decades, no longer collected. Reports that of surveys that have been conducted, suppressed. So there is a huge decline in the basic elements of democracy. And of course, all the institutions of the state are mobilized to attack opposition. Everything from, Central Bureau of Investigation to the Enforcement Directorate to the income tax people, everybody gets after you if you are a dissenter or if you're an opposition political party. So your life is a mess and you don't have the time to actually do the organizing or any of the other things that are required. So yes, democracy has been undermined in many, many ways. And it also seemed for a while as if somehow this leadership had cast a spell on the Indian people, that they were just unable to, shake off and just look at it for what it is and what it's doing. I think a lot of that is somewhat diminished now. There are still those who, fervent Modi supporters or bhakts, as we call them, religious believers, who will hold on despite everything. But more and more people are asking whether they want a Hindu state or they want a state that delivers even the more minimal things that citizens require. The right to life, for example. So I personally am hopeful also because I think the younger generation contains some amazing new leaders who have guts, who have intelligence, who have sophistication. And I do believe that, this is a terrible dark period and it will last for a bit longer, but it will not last forever. It will actually come to an end and democracy in India will survive. That's my hope anyway.
Thank you so much, Anu, for really so clearly laying out, the challenges and the successes and the learnings from those, and for speaking at length about the farmers' movement. I was actually so glad that you mentioned towards the end of your talk the contribution of the Sikh temples and the Sikh community, because that is something that stretches across the anti-CAA protests as well. When women were out on the streets, it was the Sikh temples who stepped in to provide food and provide shelter, provide everything. And similarly here too. And while people are thinking up questions to put to Anu or comments on her excellent presentation, I wanted to just add a couple of small examples of resilience and hope and community participation as well. Some of the very interesting protests have come from young cartoonists, young and old cartoonists who are quite irreverent and who make fun of the state in the way that only satirists and cartoonists can do. And there is one particular young woman who runs this cartoon strip called Sanitary Panels, in which started off as something on menstruation, but in which she has a whole range of really, really hard-hitting cartoons, which you might like to look at. And also in the first wave of the pandemic, as Anu and Jayati have both pointed out to civil society responses, I wanted to just add to that to say that women's groups came together quite strongly in that first wave to address the kind of issues that they felt the state should be aware of, and which actually governments were not looking at all. So both state government and central government, things like the closure of emergency services, the lack of abortion services, the fact that you could go to a hospital and get an abortion, but now at this time those services were suspended because all attention was given to COVID, the increase in domestic violence, the fact that when you were distributing, so here is a thing in which many civil society groups came together, which was in the distribution of essential food grains, essential food relief packages, which the state was not able to do at all. But because civil society groups have a reach on the ground, they were able to do that. And it was in that huge distribution done by civil society groups who used the funds they had, that women's groups talked about not the necessity of not only lentils and rice and wheat, but also things like sanitary towels. Because if you were locked up in your small home and shops were closed, where would you go to get sanitary products and so on? So all of these things also came in at some point. But of course, in the second wave, because it was also so difficult to step out, there was it was much more difficult to do this kind of work. And so much of the work also went online. But Anuradha has really laid out everything in quite a lot of detail. So I'm not going to, again, stand between you and her, because we still have one more presentation and we've got a time constraint. I thought this time would be more than adequate, but clearly it's not going to be. So if you have questions or comments, do please ask them in the chat box or raise your hand. Yes, Margaret, you are raising your hand, so.
Yes, thank you, Anu, for your excellent presentation. And you mentioned the powerful farmers movement. We are very impressed. And my question is, do they have any discussion for the proposal for the national land reform? I think just say no to this free laws, of course. But how about say yes to what kind of a land reform? As far as we know, very few Indian state has a land reform, including Kerala, and this is the national projects for the whole people. And then it guarantees the majority has access to land and food and social space. So my question is, what's the next step for their strategy if they continues to fight against the Modi government on the street? Any other proposal for the land reform? Thank you.
Well, you see, right now they do not have any very clear proposal for land reform. This is their one-point agenda. It is so draconian. And the thing about land reform has been, it should have happened years and years ago. But what has happened subsequently is that the large holdings have got fragmented into smaller and smaller holdings. When the government proposes land reform now, it's a private land reform, that they should sell this land, make it larger, and give the agro industries access. So right now, for the small farmer, They already have very small holdings, so they're not really interested in land reform. What they are interested in, and what they've said repeatedly, is that they're going to work for a democratic end to the Modi government. They're going to campaign in the elections, and they've already gone place to place. And they went to where the West Bengal elections were held. And of course, the West Bengal, the Modi, the BJP lost, and the regional party won. It was not on account of just farmers, but on account of a lot of things. But this is the farmers' agenda so far. But I believe that if they continue, because they have a very radical agenda in the sense of a cohesion between land, production, distribution, their own little collectives, making sure that infrastructure is developed. And there are other local problems of drug abuse, etc. So they're looking at that at the moment. So you're right, land reform is not an issue for these farmers as yet.
Other questions? Anu, one of the things that maybe while we are waiting for people to think of questions, you might like to elaborate on. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that while it's possible to file a report against one activist or two and throw them in prison on charges of sedition, when you have thousands of people sitting there, you can't easily do that, and you can't easily exercise violence. One of the things that people sort of talked about in terms of the farmers' movement and explaining why it was also so strong and why, say, a force like the army would not turn against them, was because many people in the army are actually sons of Punjab. So do you want to just maybe elaborate a little on that, that part of it?
Absolutely, and Urvashi is absolutely right, because there is a discourse in Punjab which is actually appealing to the army and to others, saying that you don't have to be landowners now, but this is what your origins were of each of you. Each of you has a peasant, landlord, work, related to the land. They don't talk in terms of peasantry, but they talk in terms of the relation to the land that each person has. And they say, look into your grandparents and to your ancestry, and who hasn't come from the land. And this is what has been a very big binding factor, really. So, and land is a very emotive issue, especially in Punjab and in Haryana, and in wherever there are small farmers. Land is nation, land is mother, and all those symbols have been continuously evoked. And they said so often that we are willing to die, but we will not give up land. Old men, and you can see weather-beaten men who were farmers have come and said, I've come here to stay here forever, but I won't give up my land. And as far as sedition is concerned, we remember the case of Navdeep Kaur, a Dalit woman who was charged and imprisoned and, sexually assaulted. So women have faced this on their bodies also. It's not that they haven't. And there are people who've been faced with sedition, but there is a collective. The lawyers in Punjab will back and give their services for free, unlike the rest of the country, for those who are being charged. So there is a solidarity, there is a compassion, there are all kinds of adjectives which we can use to describe what is happening. And I think there is also happening a gradual social movement. The old kind of masculinity associated with Punjab is decreasing, and a sense of community is increasing, a respect for women is increasing, and they're being seen as partners in this struggle, as are the landless and the lower castes, etc. Thank you.
So there's a question asking you to elaborate on what you said about caste relationships transforming as a result of the farmers' movement. So could you talk a little more about that? And then there's a couple of other questions, but I'll come to those after you've elaborated on this. How substantial is that change from your observation?
Yeah, on the caste question, you see, Punjab has quite a strong caste system. There are the Jat Sikhs, there are the Mazbis, but in these differences did not come to bear. And there seemed to be a strong unity between these groups. The Jat Sikhs are the ones who are, the dominant community and the landowners. But the relations of agriculture in Punjab and Haryana and others are, it's related to the mandi. It's related to those who are the intermediaries. The government tried to say that the intermediaries are profiteers and they are harmful, but the profiteers, the so-called profiteers, the intermediaries, the farmers said they are also important for us. So the whole system, like a interconnected wheel or a weave, came together, and they came together to show that not all of them were dependent on each other, and they would see each other as equally important. And this is where I feel that there can be this social change, because they've stood together in solidarity, they've lived together, they've eaten together. And Punjab has this tradition of langars, of eating together, community kitchen, sanja chula, the women coming together to make rotis at the tandoor in the evenings. So these traditions have actually been revived. And when these people were agitating here, we should see what's happening in the villages. There was a community coming together, a discussion. There would be morchas or protests in the village square if those women and others who could not come to Delhi would protest at their local sites. So it was more than just a protest site here. The whole state and had transformed into protest, to the extent that the state government completely had to back it. It was expedient for all political parties in the opposition to back it. And no political party which backed these laws is going to win an election in Punjab, I think, for the next 10 years at least. Thanks.
So there are 3 questions. I'm going to link them up and transform them into 2 questions, because one is linked to the other. So one is, if the pandemic is better controlled in the state where there was a leftist political party, does India need a leftist political party in the federal government? And linked to this is the question about Indian scholars and their attitudes to capitalism. So I think you could perhaps take those 2 together. And the other question, I'll just mention it to you, then you can see what order you want to do it in, is that if the current activism is mostly small scale, what should be, or what could be the agenda for a large scale and long-term activism in India? So take them in whichever order you prefer.
Well, last question, of course, this is not a small scale agitation, it's huge. It's the largest agitation the world has seen in recent times, actually. So it is huge. Second, about capitalism and the left parties.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, as far as, of course, India needs a left, but the left has to be much more creative because they have not captured the imagination in all of India outside Kerala. And the left is supporting the farmers' movement in a big way, but the farmers have their own leaders. They don't have left leaders. There is a left faction within their leadership, but they have their own local leaders. So the left parties are supporting it from outside, but they're not inside the movement, as it were, but they would support it every way. And as far as scholars and capitalism in India, there's a wide variety of scholarship. There are, scholars who are critics of capitalism. There are scholars who are supporters of neoliberalism, of liberals. So that's an endless variety, like in any kind of country where scholarship is allowed freedom. So that's it. Thanks. Yeah.
I think just to add the first question about the size of the movement, I think the person was referring to your earlier point about smaller movements being fragmented, and that what kind of agenda is needed to,
yeah, you see this earlier movements which we spoke about, like the CAA or the environmental movement, etc. They do not have the kind of mass support because of the kind of poverty, illiteracy, and hundreds of different factors in India. People are, sort of working from morning to evening to make their living. Of course, maybe a lot of them may support it, but they go with larger, wider things. But this particular movement impacts everyone in the state of Punjab. So therefore, it's become a mass movement. Now, if this movement was to give a call for that, our environment is being ruined, like, for example, the Chipko movement years back in Uttarakhand, where in the state or the hill state of Uttarakhand, people started grabbing trees. Anything linked with livelihood becomes a much bigger movement than that which is linked to a future reform. Whether it's climate extinction or the women's movement, etc. It has support, but it doesn't have this kind of mass support because this is concerned with the everyday livelihood of people. Thanks.
Anu, I'm going to put a last question to you. I think you'll probably have a short answer to that because you've already addressed it. The question is, it's important for people to rescue themselves, but socially most farmers are Dalits, but that's not correct, right? So how can the farmers rally strength to further their rights?
No, in fact, most of the landless are Dalits. They're landless labor and they're migratory labor. But they also know that there'll be no place for them in a new social and economic structure where land will be privatized, industrialized, mechanized, etc. So that is why they're very much with the landowners in this movement. Thanks.
Kinchi looks like she wants to say something.
Yes, actually, I would be interested in how you would be responding to what SAINATH has said. Yeah, of course, it's a little bit unfair because he cannot respond to you. But well, he was talking about the mass media, the kind of social polarizations. So, would you agree with him or would you not agree with him on some of the points that he made? But then in addition to that, I'd like to add a few questions because just now I was translating the questions from the audience in China. But then I have some questions of my own, and I hope some of the panelists here that are here on Zoom could also participate in the discussions. One question is about what SAINATH mentioned about health. So I think in India you have actually quite a good health system. I mean, in some ways, it wasn't that much privatized. So, but then this time we heard that 25% of the vaccines have been handed over to the private sector. So, and I think Jayati also mentioned that. So, how has that been been done? Because I think SAINATH, he in his longer version of his video, he actually mentioned Ireland and some other countries that immediately nationalized the health system as soon as the pandemic hit. But then, so how is that health system in India? But of course, it could be varying from state to state. So that's my first question. The second question is, we've heard a lot about the farmers' struggles. And so is the reporting on the farmers' struggles really that bad? According to what SAINATH has been saying, that the mass media, most of the editors are simply cowards, or has it actually also drawn a lot of attention or solicited support and solidarity from within India? Because from outside of India, so for example, at the World Social Forum in January this year, there was a lot of discussions, and I think a lot of movements outside India have been very much inspired, and also very much inspired by the farmer struggles, and had been seeing this as a light of hope, not only for India but also in the world at large. So that's my second question. And the third question is, Urvashi, you have been working so much on with women in different women's communities, from Kashmir, from the Northeast, with Pakistan, with other countries in South Asia. And how do you see, how do you have some stories to tell about how the women in those communities have been helping each other? Or because I think for one lesson I think from Kerala is that there had been so much community organizing. The people had been so used to mutual help that when a disaster hits, then the people are more ready to respond. But I know that you have done so much with women, with women's communities. So how have they been reacting? So, for example, we've heard a lot also about SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, and so for example, how have they been responding? So well, these are some questions that I hope maybe Urvashi, maybe Anu could also respond to. And also actually among the panelists here, I also see one person, Asim. I don't know whether Asim would want to say something. That is the translator of Arundhati Roy's article about the pandemic in Chinese. And that article has been read, I think, by over 500,000 people in China. So somehow I think for certain audience in China, then they also have some sense of how of how this question is perceived by progressive feminists and intellectuals.
Okay, thanks, Kinchi. I don't know if Anu is back. Anu, are you there? Yeah, she's...
Yes, I'm there, but my internet is a bit unstable. Okay. So I'll quickly just answer the one on health, which Kinchi raised, because actually India has one of the most privatized health systems in the world. So, but India has one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world, shockingly privatized. And there are multiple systems, moreover. There are, the local Indian Ayurveda and unregistered practitioners and the doctors. There are also primary health centers throughout the country, in the villages, etc. But they're very under, very poor infrastructure and very badly funded, and often not pretty terrible doctors. So the health system gets a very low funding, like less than 2% of every year's budget since independence goes on health, whereas more than all of education and health and all of social sector spending, double of that goes to defense. And those of us who say, that defense spending should now be cut, and it should go to health are seen as anti-national or not strategic or etc. So health is not in a good way, even though there are some, there's a very fantastic vaccine manufacturing system in the private sector. A lot of the public sector medical systems have been privatized, but nonetheless, there are also, government hospitals and public hospitals which continue to perform despite the fact that they are very poorly funded, and there are wonderful system of and men and women, doctors and nurses who look after this, who are in the care industry. And all this was very badly exposed during COVID, where they just could not cope. And that is why hundreds and thousands, maybe over 1 million people have died and unaccounted for. Now, the global health movement and the peace movement have said repeatedly that if just 0.07 of the trillions of dollars spent on defense globally is diverted to health, it would vaccinate the entire globe. But you can see, nobody pays heed to this globally, and no one pays heed to it in India either. So even while the pandemic was going on, the defense deals, etc., continued. Whereas there was no, of course, there were makeshift hospitals and some amount of, because nobody wants to lose a good election either. But it's far from what is really needed. The priority is not there. So I'll leave the other questions to Urvashi and your other panelists. Thanks.
Yeah, I think another issue with the health system is that conceptually, this idea of government hospitals and the state providing free health services to the poor, what it's based on, that basis does not really exist. One, as Anu pointed out, is the infrastructure at the village level, district level, and so on. And the other is in appointments, of doctors, of nurses, of healthcare workers, because for the longest time, these have been held up, and so many posts are lying vacant, which the state does not fill. And if and when they do fill them, or if and when they draw on them, so for example, right now during the pandemic, it became very clear that health personnel were too few to tackle the crisis, and that we needed more people. And the idea was to draw on senior medical students to get them to come in and at least help with some of the services. But the money that they were being offered was a real pittance. And the conditions of bringing them in were also really terrible. So that there isn't the political will to see health as being the basis for creating good citizenry and, as a basis for moving ahead. I mean, Amartya Sen has often said, you can't be a global power and be filled with unhealthy and malnourished people. That's the state's imagination of itself. So the health system, I don't think is great, and yet it's capable of so much. So as Jayati pointed out, in vaccination, with the polio vaccine, with the smallpox vaccine, etc., in a very short time, this country has managed to do really well with it, but it really requires a certain kind of political will, which just doesn't exist. I think the question on media and SAINATH's, what SAINATH said about editors quaking at their knees and bending over backwards to please the state. This is in fact quite true, and the farmers' movement in the early days did see some coverage in the media, but subsequently the state stepped in many ways, including one of the things they did was that in the area where the farmers are on one of the borders of Delhi, they shut it off, cordoned it off by creating cement barricades around where the farmers were seated, and by putting iron spikes into the ground, into the cement, so that no lorries carrying foodstuff, no water, nothing could get through, and also no journalists, because for a journalist to get through to that area, they would have to come to some place kilometers away and then walk or take, local transport or something and find their way there. So that was also a very effective way of blocking off. So we have a combination of a servile media. There is no doubt about that, although there are actors, there are media channels, as Jayati pointed out, as Anu pointed out, web papers, etc., which are very, very progressive and which talk and write about all of these issues. The NDTV television channel, its Hindi channel, has done, I don't know how many programs on the farmers' protest consistently. But by and large, mainstream media, you hardly see anything about the farmers' strike. And if you see information, it is the farmers who are branded as criminals, as anti-national, all of that. Also, there is a real fear because journalists are getting targeted, imprisoned, and sedition cases are put on them for just doing their job. I don't know what the figure is, Anu, if you know it, 100 and something journalists who have been picked up and thrown into jail during this time. I don't know what exactly the figure is. So it's very difficult even for those who are able to do something. SAINATH mentioned a journalist called Kappan, who is a Muslim journalist who basically went into a place in Uttar Pradesh, a place called Hathras, where a young woman had been gang raped and killed. And he was going like other journalists to report, and he was picked up and he's been in jail since, arrested. And recently his mother passed away, and even then he wasn't given bail for doing nothing. So it's very difficult to fight that kind of targeting. And the media is definitely sort of impacted in this way. And then you asked, Kinchi, about women. So, there are many things to this. I mean, the entire system of delivery of medicines, collection of statistics, delivery of rations and relief is based on female labor, underpaid labor. So India has this vast network of workers, women workers called ASHA workers. They're accredited social health activists. And they are in theory employed, but the way you look at women's work as care work, that is how their work is perceived by the state, which underpays them grossly. They work 15 to 16 hours a day. And during the pandemic, it was their job to go house to house to collect information about infections, especially in villages and other areas. So the entire system depended on them. And many ASHA workers died, and they have been protesting for a long time, demanding better wages. The state doesn't pay any attention to them, but when it needs them, it draws on their services. So that was one aspect. The entire sort of medical care, nursing, it's 74-75% of medical workers are women. And you saw the gender divide even then. For example, nurses who were working in COVID wards had to be isolated from their families, and the state was to provide accommodation for them. But the accommodation provided to nurses was much worse than the accommodation provided to doctors who were by and large male, for whom luxury hotels were recruited and the nurses had to live elsewhere, and they were paid much less. They had to, in Delhi, the nursing union went on strike to demand wages, back pay for nurses. And the state, the Modi government did things like to thank medical workers. They had helicopters showering flower petals on them. Now, you could have paid them their wages. That would be much better than showering petals on them. So there is that aspect to it. Then in Kerala, actually, the entire system of which goes down to the community of community workers, women play a very, very strong role in that. The health minister, up until the last election in Kerala a couple of months ago, was a woman, a teacher called Shailaja teacher, and her entire committee was also made up of some very, very strong women. But Kerala also put in place this very, very interesting program called Kudumbashri, which is a program which involves poor women from the communities all through the state, involved in services like running community kitchens, providing food, and so on and so forth. And they were the ones, it was a Kudumbashri community kitchen system, which fed the state throughout the pandemic. So, which fed the migrant workers, which fed the state. And it's a very, very interesting program there. Then in some of the work that we were doing in Assam and the northeastern states, this was part of a project we were doing on women, work, and violence. We were looking at the women's work through the prism of the structural and systemic violence that they face. And the work was to be done through a system of workshops with women, so in tea plantations, construction workers, and so on. But the pandemic stopped that because we could not have any physical meetings. And so we diverted that money to providing relief packages to women. And it was young women volunteers, local community volunteers, who went out to distribute the relief in, let's say, the tea gardens or in a particular village. And one of the very, very interesting things was that the women on the ground said to them, look, you're coming here to distribute relief packages to us, but who will listen to our stories? We want to document what this time is doing to us. How will we do this? Can you help us? And so these workers, then the volunteers, basically said to the women, tell your stories into your cell phones if you have them, and not many women have them, or tell them into our cell phones. And they collected hundreds of amazing stories which can document this time in the lives of poor women. So there's a whole range of things happening like this across the country. Some to do with women's labor, some to do with documentation of women's stories, some to do with fighting for women's rights, and some to do with the kind of inputs that feminists made on issues to do with domestic violence, reactivating the helplines, on the right for women to be able to go to hospitals and access ambulances and give birth, which was also something that became really difficult. And also connections with say, for example, trans people and disabled women. One of the things that came to a stop was even the hormonal medication that you take while somebody is transitioning from, say, being male to female or the other way around. And it was women's groups that, along with trans groups, that fought for that, and that fought for access to pensions for people with disabilities who had lost their caregivers because of the stopping in transport and so on. So how would they be able to say, how would a blind person be able to go to a bank 10 kilometers away without a caregiver, without a helper, to be able to access her pension? So these were a lot of issues that women's groups brought up. So these are all, I'm just giving you bits and pieces of information, but just to show that several different kinds of things were happening. And Anuradha said over 200 journalists were imprisoned during this time. I had half that figure. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Anyone wants to? Everybody must be tired, no? We've been talking for nearly 3 hours.
Yeah, Urvashi, I have and also Anu. Yeah, I have a question about the role of traditional medicine, because apart from the question of access to the vaccination, we also try to recognize the importance of traditional medicine. For example, in China, we find that the traditional medicine is very effective and also cheap. So we once again to recognize its importance and try to promote more. So I wonder whether in India, any example or experiment to reactivate the traditional medicine in India, for example, aloe vera or others, alternative medicines. So it opened up our mind, not only to the Western medicine, but also to revisit the ancient wisdom.
Well, India also has a tradition of traditional medicine, but you see, even for traditional medicine, it must be based on science and there should be continuous research. Whereas here, in fact, it's become very controversial because this government is actually promoting traditional medicine over science. And they have their favorite crony people who run these large kind of corporations manufacturing traditional Ayurvedic medicines, but their scientificity has not been proven. And for example, advocating cow urine as a cure for COVID. Now, anyone who believes in science is not going to believe in that. So over here, it's, they could have developed a more scientific approach towards it. And maybe they will, because they're so hell-bent on promoting traditional Indian medicine. But the science part of it has sadly been, of course, people use it as an, they have homeopathic and they have the allopathic and they have the Ayurvedic and they'll have green tea and they'll have whatever, but as a full system, it hasn't really been proven to be as effective as other systems. So I'll end there.
Margaret, if I can add to that, so one of the reasons why Kerala is believed to have done so well in terms of dealing with the pandemic is also because Kerala has a very strong parallel tradition of allopathic and Ayurvedic medicine. And Ayurveda is part of the culture of Kerala. So the entire, you've been there, massages and different kinds of herbs and so on and so forth. And that's believed to be one of the reasons also that it has actually had the kind of acceptability and success that it has had. Across the rest of India, as Anuradha said, traditional medicine of different kinds, Ayurvedic, homeopathic, Unani, etc., these have all been very strong and they have continued to be used. But where COVID is concerned, this government promoted this God man who is their crony called Baba Ramdev, who produced, and he's got huge monetary concessions and so on and so forth. And he first released a drug called Coronil, which he claimed, and this was long before any vaccines were on the horizon, which he claimed was a cure for COVID. And then, of course, this was rubbished because there was nothing to prove that this was a cure for COVID. And people said, yes, it may be an immunity booster, but it's not really a cure. Then he released a few other things where the health minister and everybody was present on the same platform with him. And they came in for a lot of criticism. And he made a claim on television that allopathy had killed 10,000 doctors as a result during the COVID pandemic. Completely untrue. So as Anu said, it's sort of got embroiled in a lot of controversy publicly, whereas privately, those people who swear by traditional medicine will continue to swear by traditional medicine. They have their reasons for doing so. And often a lot of people will use a mix of both. But because of the way the pandemic shaped up here, where the cause of death in the second wave was by and large a lack of oxygen. So what was really needed was not medication, but oxygen so much more. And that was really what killed so many people.
Urvashi, I think maybe we could entertain the last question, which is on the chat room.
From Asim?
Yes.
Arundhati's piece in The Guardian into Chinese. I cannot speak right now. I've noticed several criticism against Roy's piece once it was out for being Savarna and overlooking casteism in relation to the pandemic. I wonder what the panelists think about it and the relation between the pandemic and casteism in general. Okay, I think Asim and Anu might want to come in here, but I think that both Anuradha and Jayati and in fact SAINATH have spoken about how the pandemic has heightened existing inequalities and how it has hit those on the margins of our society hardest. Anu, the question is one about Arundhati's piece and how it ignores caste, and it is Savarna in many ways been criticized for being Savarna. And what do the panelists think about that piece and the relation between the pandemic and caste in general? Casteism, but caste, I guess, in general. So I'm just saying that it has...
I haven't read this article, actually.
Anu, have we lost you?
Yeah, no, I haven't read the article, but I don't think Arundhati has ever been Savarna in anything she's written. She represents people, and the fact is that, but I didn't see any of this criticism. So I'm out of this debate, actually. I haven't seen Arundhati's article.
So I think that, Asim, I'm not sure where you've seen the criticism, but I wouldn't be surprised by it because I think there are two things here. Writer like Arundhati comes in for a lot of criticism as much as she comes in for appreciation because of the way she says things. Often they are very black and white, but she also has a huge, huge reach, and sometimes reactions to her work are colored by people who see her as a rich writer or something like that. Sometimes there is that kind of thing, but also there is, there is a very, very strong critique of writing that is oblivious to or that ignores caste. I have read Arundhati's piece, but I don't remember it now because I read it when it initially came out, and I don't remember whether, I can't imagine that she would ignore caste. She, I doubt very much that she would do that, but maybe she didn't talk about it in detail. That I can't say. But I think that what's very important is that during the pandemic, it has become very clear that all sorts of inequalities and caste inequalities in particular have been exacerbated. A lot of Dalits have been very angry because of the vocabulary of social distancing, where they say that that is a reality, everyday reality for them. And to valorize something like that, which is why they have asked that they speak of social physical distancing, not social distancing. And also that the kinds of occupations that often the so-called untouchable castes have to do are very public occupations and so hazardous to health anyway. And there was no stopping those kinds of things. So while the lockdown may have protected wealthy people inside their homes, but sanitary activities, etc., still had to go on, and they continued to make people vulnerable. A lot of labor and especially in particular kinds of jobs, a lot of labor is Dalit labor from the so-called untouchable castes, and they have suffered much, much more as a result of the loss of jobs and so on. So there are all of these elements to it, the pandemic, which is, as I said, heightened inequalities. And maybe Arundhati's article does not speak enough about this. I don't know. I read it a long time ago and I read it in a hurry. So I also don't recollect it, but I shall, now that you've raised it, I shall go back and read it. But yeah, as Anuradha says, that Arundhati is known to speak on behalf of the poor and the Dalits, so it would be unlike her to write something that that doesn't.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Urvashi and also Anu. Tonight we have very rich and wonderful dialogues and debate. I think the whole panelists actually are known to speak for the poor and the Dalits, particularly during the pandemic. So once again, thank you for all.